And let me just introduce Elaine. She is a horticulturalist trained in sustainable landscape management at the New York Botanical Garden, where she continues to study botany, ecology, and landscape design. She has a small horticulture practice in Bergen County, where she advises clients on sustainability techniques, designs gardens based on native plants, and speaks to local gardening and community groups. She is also a founder and one of the leaders of the Bergen Passaic chapter of the Native Plant Society of New Jersey and co-chair of the Glen Rock Shade Tree Advisory Committee. So Elaine, welcome and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you for inviting me. I hope you can hear me clearly because I think those storms are moving in. Okay, so what I'm going to focus on tonight is habitat. Not so much individual plants and pretty plants, even although they are very pretty, but habitat. So we're going to start by looking at habitat, then we'll define a habitat, and then we'll talk about how you can create a habitat. This is my best example of a created habitat, or a habitat that was created within a natural habitat that had been degraded. And it's the garden at the headquarters of the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference, which is in Mahwah, up almost in New York State. The Bergen Passaic chapter of the Native Plant Society helps to maintain this through a volunteer program at the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference. You guys, many of you, if you're from the southern part of the state, you may not be as much aware of the work of the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference because it does tend to focus on northern New Jersey and New York, but it's an organization that maintains all of the hiking trails in the region and also does a great deal of work with identifying invasive plants and removing them and planting new native plants instead. So about 5 years ago, this habitat was designed as a model for what a beautiful native habitat should look like. You can see it here in 6 years ago now. You can see it here in 2015 when it was designed, and this is what it looked like in 2019. It had more than filled in. The habitat includes several different areas. It was designed by Rich Pildar, who's a landscape architect, and it's intended as a habitat. So it's based on native species that are all adapted to the wetland site. There is a river that runs around in back of the habitat. And what we did was we looked at what was there, we looked at what should be there, and we looked at what shouldn't be there. In other words, the native plants that existed, the plants that should be included, that should be reintroduced to make a native habitat, and the plants that needed to be removed, because that's a constant battle, removing invasive plants. So the design includes trees, shrubs, grasses, ferns, and it incorporates wild plants and the other natural features that were present. There's lots of rockery. We found out that there's a place where turtles breed in this habitat. So we try to do everything possible to encourage that, and they do breed there. We find eggs. Many species of birds, reptiles, and mammals and insects live there, and maintenance is ongoing, which is kind of a key point about creating and maintaining a native habitat. So this garden demonstrates the philosophy and the aesthetic that I'm going to share with you today. It's a really good model of what I would like to encourage you to do. Throughout the season, there's a program through the Trail Conference called Habitat Helpers, and volunteers just do the normal work that has to be done: the spring cleanup, the planting, the weeding, the pruning, the trimming, and removing invasives, all that stuff that has to be done in any native plant garden. I'm probably in this. I am in this somewhere, but I'm not going to point me out to you. And there are many species. Most of them introduced. Some things pop up. This is dogbane, which is in the milkweed family, and it popped up. Who knew? We didn't even recognize it when it came up, but it does really well, and the pollinators love it. There's a great variety of species. The major grass that was used, and grasses are really important in the native habitat. is panic grass, and that's what this is. Is probably picture was probably taken in early summer, so it hasn't stalked out and seeded yet. But you can see that it's just a combination of things that were there and things that were added. So with that introduction, I'd like to step back and talk about what a habitat is. And it's really a very simple concept. A habitat is the natural home or environment of an animal or a plant or any other organism. And a habitat, because this organism lives in it, these organisms live in it, it contains all the resources the organisms need to survive: food, water, and shelter. So here are some examples. This is just a picture that I took. I think it's particularly beautiful. It's along a river in Maine. So this is a riverine habitat. And the trees would be different here than they would be on top of a mountain. And the animals would be different. But it's a complete habitat. It does include lots of creatures and lots of food and water and shelter. This is an underwater habitat. Again, the plants in particular are going to be very different than they would be here, or they would be here. This is a backyard habitat, and it's a backyard that was planted to try to become a habitat and to try to provide those three key things in its own environment, in its environment. Excuse me. We're going to return to this picture of the backyard after we look at a schematic of a habitat. So, a multi-layered backyard habitat, and multi-layered is very important because nature is almost always multi-layered. When you start to look at forests, you find out that they always have layers. And in this area, in New Jersey in particular, almost everything is eventually going to be forest. So when you talk about a diverse habitat garden, and this is a great schematic drawing that actually comes from Australia. So the plants obviously look very different from ours, but the concept is exactly the same. You have a canopy, which has the tallest trees, and there are going to be some animals that live up there in the canopy. We know that squirrels nest up there. We know a lot of birds will nest up in the canopy. You have a mid-story of shrubs and smaller trees. And again, there are animals that particularly nest there. I don't know if you're familiar with catbirds, but those are species that want a shrub layer. They want to live in a shrub layer. So you need a tall layer, you need a mid-height layer, and you need an understory and ground cover. If you have all these layers, you're starting to create a complete habitat. You need some layered vegetation. You need some tightly planted vegetation on the floor. You need the leaf litter. That's particularly important. You need some rocks for creatures to hide under, or some dead logs, and you need some water. If you look at this habitat, this was entirely planted. This was a backyard that was nothing but lawn. And then this is actually my backyard. About 25 years ago, we started planting little tiny trees, and this is what it looks like now. So you have the tall layer, you have the mid-height layer, you have the understory, and you have lots and lots of leaf litter, because no work is ever done back here except for removing invasive plants. My neighbors have English ivy and Norway maple, so I have to go through and pull seedlings. But that's the only thing that I ever do here. You also have lots of places for, this is a backyard habitat, but there's lots of places for humans to be as well. There is a small water feature, just a bird bath back here that you can't see. And you have obviously lots and lots of food for animals. This picture was taken in September. So you've got some berries. This is Viburnum trilobum, American cranberry bush. You've got lots of flowers, so you still have pollinators. And we're going to talk about all those specific things later. But that's how you translate the schematic of a habitat into a real backyard. And again, we're going to come back to this. Ecologists like to say, if you plant it, they will come. Meaning that if you put the right plants in place, the animals are going to come to eat them. Because plants are the basis of the food chain for all living things. And again, this is true only if you don't use pesticides. If you do, these guys are not going to come. So we have native plants are going to feed native insects, particularly moths and butterflies, throughout their life cycle. This was, I believe it's a juvenile red shoulder. There's probably a panelist who knows that better than I do. This picture was taken a few years ago. And this guy hangs out in my neighbor's big oak tree that overlooks my yard in the winter very frequently. This was a dead limb of a Norway maple that we left on the tree as long as we possibly could. It did finally fall off. Actually, the maple finally fell down, I'm happy to say, and I planted an oak. But for years, it was a condo for woodpeckers. There were lots and lots of big holes in this large branch where they all lived. One thing that happens in my garden every year, this flower is ninebark, which is a beautiful native shrub in the rose family. And every spring when it blooms in May, I suddenly will see dozens of red admirals coming to nectar on them. So when I see a new butterfly, I look to see what its host plant is. The host plant of red admirals is nettles. Now, nobody wants nettles in their yard. They're weedy and they can hurt you if you touch them, and we don't want them in our yard. But what I discovered was, I knew there was a stream about a block and a half away from my house, and nettles tend to grow along streams. So those red admirals are probably being born. They're emerging. Their caterpillars ate those nettles. They pupated there. They emerged as adults, and then they flew around to look for food, because every year when this blooms, these guys probably have just emerged and they come to eat it. They come to nectar on it. So you need all of these pieces in place, and then you'll start to see this kind of web of life happening in your backyard. When you plant a habitat, you want to plant for all seasons and for the entire life cycle. And again, you don't want to use pesticides. Just very quickly, I think most people are familiar with the life cycle of a monarch butterfly, but it lays its eggs on milkweeds, and only on milkweeds, which are a genus of native plants. This is the egg. It's very tiny. This is the caterpillar that's probably in a fairly late stage. There's the pupae, and you usually don't find the pupae on the milkweeds. I rarely see them. I see just emerged butterflies. I see caterpillars, but I almost never see the pupae in my yard. And then you have the adults, and the adults nectar on a wide variety of plants, not just on milkweed. It's the caterpillars that need the milkweed. So that's a life cycle. Other things are happening because you have native plants that bring that, and you don't use pesticides, and therefore you have lots of caterpillars. If you do that, you're going to have birds, because birds need insects to feed their young. Again, you can see that this bluebird is bringing caterpillar. This chickadee has a nice juicy caterpillar for its babies. You want to make sure there's food in winter as well. So this is holly that still has some, it usually holds some berries throughout the winter. We're also going to talk about later when you plant native perennials and grasses, you want to leave them standing, because that's shelter and food for the whole winter. So you want to plant for the whole life cycle. This I find fascinating, and this is a spring or summer azure. They look very similar, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong about what it is, but in my yard, I have several species of flowering dogwood shrubs, native dogwood shrubs. And I also have, this is New Jersey tea, Ceanothus americana, a beautiful little shrub. So the larval food of this butterfly is the flowering parts of these shrubs. So what I find happening in my yard is the dogwoods bloom first. So when the dogwoods are in bloom, I'll suddenly see these tiny little flecks of blue flying very rapidly around. The whole butterfly is about an inch, and they fly very rapidly. And then I'll see, soon after that, the New Jersey tea is budding, and then you'll see she's laying her eggs on the New Jersey tea for another generation. So, and all that is happening because I have these two different species of native plants in my yard. And that's obviously that something there's something that happens in nature. I didn't plan it. I didn't know it when I planted those plants, but I planted those plants and there they are. And it's every year and it's wonderful to see. Okay, so just to sum up, why are native plants critical to habitat? And a lot of this research has been done by Doug Tallamy and his team. They actually measured the percentage of biomass that has to be native in order for one clutch of chickadees to be raised in a season. And it has to be 70% of the local biomass. In other words, the total weight of all the plants in a yard has to be native in order for one tiny little chickadee to be able to raise a clutch. And that's because the caterpillars are all very specific in their needs and they can only eat native plants. So no native plants, no caterpillars, no birds. It's really as simple as that. I would encourage you to read Doug Tallamy's work. It's in the resource list that you'll get. Now to backtrack, what is a native plant? And there are many different definitions. I'm actually giving you two here. A plant that was here before Europeans arrived on this continent. Because if you think about it, when the first cow stepped off the Mayflower, she pooped, and there were lots and lots of non-native plant seeds in her poop. So boom, we had non-native plants there. We have a whole category of plants that we call European agricultural weeds. So a plant that was here before Europeans arrived. And you could also, another way to think of it is that a plant that evolved here within the native habitat, it evolved in competition with all the other plants around it, because plants are in competition, and plants and insects in particular are in competition continually all the time. I also like to further refine that definition to say that a native plant is a member of a pure species rather than a cultivar or a hybrid. So this is the flowers of Viburnum dentatum, arrowwood viburnum. It's a species, it's a pure species. Nature made it. Nobody has tried to improve it or change it in any way. If you see Viburnum dentatum or Viburnum single quotes, blue muffin, that is a cultivar of Viburnum dentatum. It means that somebody has changed something. I try to avoid cultivars, but if I use them, I'll only use cultivars that have changed something very, something that really is not going to affect the insects very much. So in other words, there is an upright species of panic grass. Most panic grass spreads in a fountain-like, and it's 5 feet tall, so the plants can be very big, so they can be hard to design, but there's an upright one, and it probably hasn't changed very much else about that plant. So if you find a plant that's maybe a little bit shorter or a little bit taller and is a cultivar, for the most part, they're safe to use. Again, you need to bring it into your garden and you need to see if it works. You need to see if creatures eat it and if it attracts pollinators. But I would never plant a cultivar that changes the flower form, the flower color, the flower shape, or that changes the leaf color at all. Because if you change the leaf color, you're changing the leaf chemistry. And as we've already seen, caterpillars need to eat those leaves. So go on. So that's a very basic definition of a native plant. So why plant native plants? They are beautiful and they're easy to grow, relatively easy to grow, but they can be hard to find. That can be the hardest part. There is a native plant for any site, no matter how difficult it is. I very often have clients tell me, well, you know, I've tried this and this and this and this and this site and nothing will grow there. And when I look at the site, I know that they haven't tried the right plant. Something will always grow there. Native plants are an essential part of the native habitat, as we've already seen. Only native plants can feed insects throughout their life cycles. No native plants, no insects. And birds depend on insect protein to feed their young. No insects, no birds. This one point I want to make, and I should have made it earlier. I think most people know that monarch butterflies, their caterpillars can only eat milkweed. They can only eat plants in the genus Asclepias, and we have about a dozen species in that genus. But they can only eat plants in that genus. What I think most people don't understand is that all caterpillars are that specific in what they can eat. So I mentioned before that the caterpillars of red admirals eat nettles. The caterpillars of fritillaries, which is a large family of butterflies, and they are as beautiful as their name, they can only eat violet leaves. I mentioned the spring azure, and they can only eat the flowering parts, only the flowering parts, not even the leaves, of two different groups of native shrubs. So everything is that specific in the larval stage, in the caterpillar stage. Very often, butterflies themselves are generalists, the adult butterflies that we see. So you may plant a butterfly bush, a buddleia, which is not a native plant and in fact is invasive, and think that you're feeding lots and lots of butterflies. But unfortunately, what you are doing is you are feeding the adults, but you're not providing any food for the larvae. So it's really important to plant native plants for that reason, particularly if you want to create a habitat. Okay, how do I know if a plant is native? There are a bunch of different references that are excellent. There is the USDA plant database, the Ladybird Johnson wildflower. This is right over here. The Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center, which can be accessed at wildflower.org. The Native Plant Society of New Jersey, Go Botany, which is from New England, or BONAT, the Botanical Atlas of North American Plants. But something that will be a good clue all the time is the word Chinese or Norway or English in the title, in the common name of the plant, is telling you pretty much that that's not native. So just as an example, these are the flowers of Viburnum trilobum, our native cranberry bush. It has several Latin names, so that's the one that I learned, and there are others for this plant. So these are the flowers of our native, of one of our native viburnums. We have several. And this is the flower of Korean spice viburnum. Now, this is very often planted as a landscape plant. Luckily, to my knowledge, it doesn't become invasive, but some plants some viburnums are very much becoming invasive, some non-native ones. But people plant it because it has this wonderful, wonderful fragrance. But unfortunately, it doesn't help our native insects at all. Whereas these little tiny flowers are going to attract lots and lots of native insects, and also the leaves are going to be eaten by our native caterpillars. So look for that. Things like these are very good clues, and these are all good references to find out if a plant is native. Okay, what's wrong with cultivars? I mentioned briefly that cultivars are not a great idea. So this is a native species. It's Echinacea purpurea. Some people actually say it's not native to New Jersey. Most people say it is. Okay, let's call it native for now. It's native enough that we can use it as an example. This is what the species looks like. Notice these are actually the flowers. These things that we call that we think this is the flower. These are just modified leaves. These are the flowers, and there's a gazillion of them, and there's lots of teeny little flowers in there. Typically, this is a member of the composite family, like Rudbeckias and asters, and what an insect will generally do is sort of walk around and pollinate all these different flowers. So this is what an insect is looking for, and they don't see in the same way that we do. They see in the infrared spectrum. They see in all different ways. They are sensing all different chemicals, so they can recognize this flower. This flower, this is a double flower of this, as is this one. There's no flowers here. There are no flowers here. This is all petals, all modified leaves. So there is no way that an insect could pollinate this flower and make seed for the next generation. because there's no flower there at all. In this one, the flower has been retained, but the color is so wonky that it's very likely that no insect would recognize this at all. We very often don't know what they're looking for, but we know that they're looking for this. We don't know why, what the exact clues are all the time, but they're not looking for this. So I would encourage you to plant species, and particularly don't plant cultivars that change the flower. Double flowered plants are very often sterile. Don't plant cultivars that change the flower or that change the leaf color. So growing your own native habitat. So as we have already seen, a native habitat is made up of native plants that will attract butterflies and birds and other wild creatures. Anyone with an outdoor space, no matter how small it is, how shady, or how poor the soil, can grow a native habitat. You can do it in 3 square feet. If you have 3 square feet in a sunny spot, even if the soil is like beach sand, which is what my soil was like when I started gardening, you could plant a milkweed, a native grass, and an aster. This is red milkweed, or Asclepias incarnata, swamp milkweed. And even though it's called swamp milkweed, it does fine in dry soil. This is New England aster. Again, it's a plant that in nature, it tends to grow in moist places, but it does perfectly fine in dry soil. This is little blue stem, which I think is one of the most beautiful and certainly easy to grow of our native plants. It's a plant that in nature, the only place I've ever seen it in nature around this area or New England is when you climb to the top of a hill and it's all rocky on top, and the little blue stem will be growing out of the clefts and the rock on top in the hot, dry, sunny places. So if you planted these 3 plants in 3 square feet, or even in 3 pots, 3 big pots, because they get big, you would have flowers from late May or early June through October. You would attract pollinators by the hundreds, and you would be feeding the caterpillars of many plants. Asters are a particularly important plant for feeding native caterpillars, and we all know about monarchs and milkweed. So that's a really simple way that we could start with 3 square feet or 3 pots. So the first step in designing a garden, and here we get down to the nitty-gritty, you want to evaluate your site. Is it wet or dry? By the way, it's starting to thunder here, so I hope you don't lose me, or I don't lose you. Is it wet or dry? Is it sunny or shady? What plants are already present? And what do you want it to look like? Very basic questions that you ask yourself. Because by the way, a native plant garden can be formal or very informal. That just depends on what you want it to look like. You want to start by researching native plants and their habitats so that you can design a complete habitat, plants that work together. So 2 really good places to start are the websites of the Native Plant Society of New Jersey or Jersey Friendly Yards. Jersey Friendly Yards in particular has a wealth of information on the website for people who are just starting out. For a pollinator garden, if you specifically want a pollinator garden, consult the Xerces Society or NABA. Again, Jersey Friendly Yards and field guides to eastern butterflies. Good ones will list the host plants of the butterflies. But the Xerces Society and NABA both have, NABA is the North American Butterfly Association. They have, and the Xerces Society is about all invertebrate creatures. So they have on their websites, they have plant lists arranged by region of the country. So you could find one for the Mid-Atlantic and just use that to as the basis of your garden. NABA also certifies butterfly habitat gardens. For information about bird-friendly gardens, consult the Audubon Society. In particular, Bergen Audubon up here in the north. Again, it certifies gardens and it has all kinds of information about how to do that. But the Audubon Society in general has been much more involved with getting people to grow native plants in the past few years because they know how important they are to butterflies. Field guides, and something that I rely on very often when I'm researching a new property, is the Peterson Guide to Eastern Forests. It's part of the Peterson Field Guide series. It tells you what plants grow together in communities. So in other words, if you have red maple trees in your yard, that's telling you that the soil is wet or moist. And this guide can tell you what plants in nature would grow under those red maple trees, so you could restore the native habitat. This is how I think when I'm designing a garden. I think in terms of what trees are there and what plants need to be underneath them. I mentioned Doug Tallamy before. He has a couple of books. He has a brand new book just on oak trees, but his books, Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Last Hope, they really are very specific about the hows and the whys of native plant gardening, why you should do it and how you can do it. There are two excellent searchable databases for selecting native plants. One is at, again, wildflower.org, and the other is on Josie Friendly Yards. And I used this just today, just to play with it. I had never used the one on Josie Friendly Yards before, but I just played with it. And I was looking for shrubs for a dry site in the Piedmont region, which is where I live, for a very well-drained site, and for shade or part shade. And I immediately came up with 21 shrubs. So it's a really good place to start. The Wild Ones is a really great organization. Unfortunately, we don't have one we don't have a chapter of the Wild Ones. It's an organization devoted to native plants. We don't have one in New Jersey, in this area. They tend to be in the Midwest, but their website has a selection of professional garden designs based on native plants. They are for different regions of the country, but the designs themselves are very adaptable. So that's another good place that you can look. So design considerations. What should the garden look like? So how much sun and where's the sunlight coming from? We want to plan for a succession of bloom. We want to think about how tall all the different species are, because obviously you want to think about the viewpoint, because if you're going to design a garden like this that people are going to walk around, we have to be able to look into it from all different angles. If you're going to design a garden like this, which is the foundation planted in front of the house, it's only going to be looked at this way. So that's a very big difference. How many plants? I find that the graph paper is extremely helpful in figuring out how many plants you need, because basically each square is 1 square foot. And for a lot of plants, that for most perennials and grasses and ferns, that translates into 1 plant. And do you want it to look formal or informal? This garden is kind of balanced, and you have the same plants on each side. It would look much more balanced. In this one, the plants are arranged in sort of a random way. You have to think about what's going to be in bloom at different times, and a way to do that is to do overlays for different seasons. In this one, this is a circular garden. The street is here, so the client's house is over here. So she's mostly looking at it in this direction, and she wanted some screening from the street. So there are tall shrubs here that are screening her property. And we have a lot of deer. This is in my town. We have a lot of deer. So the plants on the outside, for the most part, are plants that deer don't eat. Whereas the plants in the inside here, like the asters, are the plants that they love the most. So you can sort of hope that they will be put off by some of the plants that they don't like. They don't, for example, eat most native grasses. There are exceptions. For the most part, they don't eat milkweed, but in a really, really cold winter, or in a really warm winter, when they don't die off, they eat everything. So those are all the different things that you look at when you design a garden. There is very sophisticated software that you can use to do this, but you can do it very simply, like this, on graph paper. So the next thing is to develop a preliminary list of plants and to prepare the site. Most native plants need no soil amendment. If you pick the right plants for your site, you should need no soil amendment whatsoever. You do not want to enrich your soil with compost or do anything like that, but you may have to kill the lawn. The simplest way to kill a lawn, and you'll read all kinds of stuff about this. You'll read about solarizing with black plastic and about lasagna methods in newspaper and cardboard. A nice thick layer of mulch applied, particularly in the fall, will kill the lawn. It will still always encroach from the outside, but it will kill the lawn. I tend to use cedar or shredded cedar or hemlock bark. And you can see this was an area before planting. We had left some plants. We were just making the focal point around this light fixture. We had left some plants. I don't remember what they are, but we had dug up everything else. And we had dug up the lawn. And actually, we didn't dig up the lawn. What I tend to do is to mow it as low as I can. And then you just put down the mulch. And then this area is ready for planting. You're going to plant right through the mulch. In particular, if you put the mulch down in the fall, mow as low as you can, put the mulch down. In the spring, the grass will be dead, and that's the best time for planting anyway. So, so this works really well. So you want to measure the area you intend to plant, and that actually, of course, would precede doing your sketch. You want to measure the area carefully. You want to know the square footage. For perennials, grasses, and ferns, I generally plan on 1 plant per square foot, and that will be a crowded garden after the first season. For shrubs, you may plan on 9 or even 16 square feet per plant, depending on the mature size. You need to source the plants, and this is the hardest part. Finding the plants you want, and you should always have alternatives in mind. And you need to order early. The best way to do this for native plant nurseries, and I do recommend using specialty nurseries. You're not going to find the plants that you want by walking into a local garden center, unfortunately. You're going to be using specialty nurseries. They're going to be some excellent ones are on the resource list you're going to receive. I recommend doing this in fall. Then you have the whole winter to plan the area. You know exactly how big it is. You know exactly what is already there. You have the whole winter, and you should order your plants by January, because plants sell out. The native plant nurseries definitely sell out. And then you would arrange to have your plants shipped to you mid-late April, which is the perfect time for planting. And there you go. You're all ready. This was a project that I did with a friend, because she told me, well, you know, my lawn looks terrible. They keep reseeding my lawn and it looks terrible. Well, the reason it looked terrible was she had these tall trees and she had shade, and grass doesn't grow in shade. So we just put down some mulch. I think we did it in summer. And you can see this was the original size of the planting around the tree. These are hostas, which are not something that I would recommend, but this is what was there, and this is what we did. So we basically mulched the whole area where the grass wouldn't grow, and then she just kind of started to plant into it. You could do this whole area as a beautiful shade garden. So these are just examples of sort of how you start, how you prepare the ground. Okay, mail order sources of native plants, and this is probably the most important slide you're going to see. I'm going to show this again at the end while I take questions at the end. So, you know, don't worry, you'll see it again. But these are all, I think these are all in New Jersey, except for IZEL, which is a new organization. And what they do is they aggregate the inventory of a number of wholesale nurseries, most of which are in the mid-Atlantic, not in New Jersey. But they then allow people to order retail from them, and the prices are excellent. You order from most of these places, what you're going to get are very small plants, and that's good, because the small plants will do better. They're going to fill in more quickly than planting large plants, which very often are greenhouse grown, and they're going to go into shock when you plant them in the ground anyway. So so these are some good sources, and I said we'll get to it at the end, and the sources will be on the resource list that you will receive. Okay, I know I covered a lot of ground, but I'm going to stop here for questions. Other questions?
Okay, there is one. I was scrolling back through them. One person asked, why do you use only cedar or hemlock mulch?
Well, first of all, they're widely available, and second of all, they break down readily. So I find that they work very well. So, and they don't, I mean, they do add some organic material to the soil, but they don't enrich the soil as much as, like, say, putting down a layer of compost would, and you don't need to do that. So I find that they work very well. I imagine I learned this in horticulture school, and that's why I've been doing it ever since. But that is what I do. There are, there's many recommendations for how to kill lawn. Very often when you're planting a garden like this, you're killing lawn. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. And also cedar smells good.
It does. It does. It smells very good. And by the way, don't ever buy dyed mulch. Because first of all, it's ugly. And second of all, you don't want that dye, even if it's a plant-based dye, you don't want that dye going into your soil.
Another person asked, do you usually do perennials using plugs, or do you also do larger plants?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you well.
Oh, the question is, do you usually do perennials with plugs or larger plants?
The smallest plant is always the best plant to use. So plugs are excellent if you can find them, or very often they come in 2 or 3 inch pots. The pots are quite small from these nurseries, but smaller is going to adapt better than a larger plant, and it's also going to be much easier to plant if you think about it. There's going to be much less work to do to put them in the ground, and they're going to adapt and grow much faster than larger plants.
Someone has a deer question. What do you advise to deter deer when the plants are tiny and delicious?
Well, they're always delicious. Wire cages work, or fencing, but it has to be high. The main thing that I do is I put the plants that they don't like. I always, and this does kind of inhibit your design a little bit, but I try to surround the plants that they like the most, like asters and phlox. Oh, the deer in my area love phlox. I try to surround them with the things that they, for the most part, don't eat, like anything in the mint family or many of the native grasses. So you try to, and also you want to spread them around. Again, don't plant, and aesthetically, this isn't always the best choice, but don't plant large clumps of anything, because boy, they're going to find them. But if you plant one phlox here and another one here and another one here, they're not going to find all of them. They tend to go back to the same place. So those are my 2 tricks for deer. In addition to just wire fencing, works better than anything. I build wire cages. You know, I buy a length of wire and I clip it and I twist it and I cage things. So you are going to have to do that.
Someone is asking for recommendation. Their property is mostly shaded due to some very tall oaks, and she wants to plant some understory material. Do you have any recommendations?
Well, yeah, I would, before making specific recommendations, I would want to know what species of oak, and I would want to know what the soil is like. So I suggest that you ID your species of oak, and then you go to, you could go to the Peterson Guide to Eastern Forests, or you can do a search of the database. Starting with, there's got to be like one shrub that's there, starting with that and looking at it. Because if you have, for example, if you have chestnut oaks, that's a very dry soil. If you have swamp white oaks, that's a totally different type of soil. And in nature, different plants are going to grow under them. So I want to know what the habitat is like before I make specific recommendations.
What are your favorite tips to stop tall wildflowers from flopping over onto pathways and driveways?
That's really easy. You have to plant tight. If they're close together, if you plant nice and tight, first of all, you're going to have less critter damage, and you're going to have the roots support each other. In nature, the grasses and the forbs, the flowering plants, always grow together because their roots are complementary, and they sort of hold each other up. and also the tight plants will hold each other up. We also create a grid out of, we put in those tall stakes, the green ones, and then we just tie some twine between them at a couple of different levels, and that holds up the whole garden. So, and we sort of do it kind of zigzag so we can get in if we have to, although by this time of the season, I can't get into my gardens anymore. They're too closely planted. So that works. Also, you want to plant a little bit back from the pathways. Don't plant right at the edge of the pathway. And that way you'll have room for the staking if it's needed. Some plants that you know really flop, you want to put that stuff in early. Like you want to support your grasses really early in the season. You don't want to wait until they're staking out. And also, very often what happens is that plants move around. I have those beautiful native rose mallows, the hibiscus mosquitoes, and they were originally in the back of my borders, and they've moved forward over time. So they would certainly obliterate my pathways if I didn't do this this grid with the twine and the tall stakes. If you use green twine and green stakes, they're really not that they're not that they don't stick out at you.
Last one. Do you have any books that you like for learning about the aesthetic principles of garden design?
I would look at Carolyn Summers' book. It's called, the author's name is Carolyn Summers, and the book is called, it's something like Designing Gardens with the Flora of the American East. And she talks about how to create an English cottage garden, a Japanese garden, any type of garden you want using our native plants. So that's a really good way to look at it. There are lots and lots of books on garden design. So I would just find the ones that you like the best. I tend to think more in terms of habitat than design. But if you need a formal design, you're going to need some more reference books than that. But Carolyn's book is a really good way to start.
Okay, there are a couple more, but I think we can save them
we
for
should
later.
probably go on.
Yeah.
Okay. Optimum planting time tends to be mid to late April. So just as this is an example of, I live in Glen Rock in Bergen County, and about, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago, I suggested to the Director of Public Works that we replant this long garden right in front of Borough Hall. It's 2 long gardens with a pathway in the middle with native plants rather than the impatiens that they were putting in. They're putting in impatiens, and there was Pennisetum grass and miscanthus, and it was ugly, and terrible. So I suggested we replant with native plants. So I did a demonstration garden the first year. So I took little tiny divisions from my garden. This is just to give you an example of how fast these things grow, how well it can do. I planted these in April. There is a sprinkler system in the ground here, although it's really not necessary. This is what it looked like in June. You can see that the coreopsis bloomed, that the penstemon bloomed. This is the asters, and they're staking out. The milkweed didn't bloom the first year. I know it's here, but I don't see it. And the grasses are still small. But this was so that was what it looked like in early June, and in early October we had this. The asters grew up and they bloomed like crazy. We have the little blue stem is blooming. The coreopsis is still in bloom, and this was not tended at all. It was on a sprinkler system, but it was not tended at all in the course of the summer. The plants grew so thickly it doesn't even need much weeding. It is now the next year the entire front of Borough Hall was planted like this, and we do just a little weeding like in June of every year, but it's so tight that nothing really needs to be done. I planted, when we did the final design, we put shorter plants around the perimeter to kind of hold everything up. And I'm sorry, this is something I should have mentioned before, but around the perimeter, there's the coreopsis and a very short, very tough grass called purple love grass. Aerograstis, I'm saying that wrong, spectabilis. And that really, it just holds the perimeter so that everything stays upright. These plants tend to stay upright, but if you would put little blue stem on the perimeter, for example, it would certainly flap over. But with the purple lovegrass, because it's shorter and stiffer, it doesn't do that. So if you choose your plants, you can keep that from happening. So that's just to show you, these were divisions, so they're going to grow much faster than seedlings. I just dug these out of my garden, but it just shows you the kind of growth that you can have and how things can fill in. Okay, care of a native plant garden. Most plants will need supplemental water during dry periods for their first growing season only. If you have chosen the right plants for your site, you should not have to water after that. If you have chosen to put wetland plants into a dry site, you're always going to have to water, but I would not recommend that you do that. I would recommend that you pick the right plants for your site. Do not use pesticides or herbicides, and beware of purchasing plants treated with systemic pesticides. A couple of years ago, the American Gardening Association put out an advisory warning people not to buy their plants from big box stores because the plants are almost always treated with systemic pesticides, specifically neonicotinoids. And if you think about it, if a plant is treated with a systemic pesticide and a caterpillar eats it, it's going to die. So you don't want those plants. Specialist nurseries will not use pesticides on your plants. You can always ask and you'll know exactly how those plants have been treated or if they've been treated. Even if you buy native plants from local nurseries, if they tend to have native plants, they may well have been treated. So you should always ask. The plants should never need fertilizer or any kind of soil amendment. Again, if you've chosen the right plants for the right place, you should not have to do anything like this. As the garden fills in, very little weeding will be necessary because it's going to be really crowded and there's not going to be a lot of room for the weeds. But the weeds that do grow, they're going to be, back here somewhere and you're not even going to see them. So at the beginning, you'll have to do some weeding while the plants are still small, but as it fills in, you will need to do very little. Do not clean up the garden in the fall. This is very important. You want to wait until new growth appears in the spring because your native plant garden is a very large bird feeder in the winter. The mixed species foraging flocks will come through, and some birds like to forage up in the branches of the plants or in the shrubs, and some like to do it in the ground. But they tend to form these mixed species flocks in the winter, and if there's lots of food, they'll all be there. I think at least as much bird activity in my garden in the winter as I do in the summer, and I never hang feeders. I do not do that. So you don't want to clean up. So, and that will feed the birds all winter, and it also will provide shelter for the insects through the winter. Many of them live either in the stalks of plants or in leaf litter. So this is just very, very easy example of garden cleanup. This is what I do, and this is again one very small section of my own gardens. This is what it looks like, say in the middle of April. You can see there's some new green growth appearing, and that's when you do it. This is what it looks like because if there's been snow, the plants are sort of going to be smushed down. I would have taken away my stakes and my strings so I can get in there now. It's the only time I actually go into the garden. And then what you do is you grasp the plants near their base or a few inches up, and you grasp a handful of plants and you go, and they break right off. If you tried to do this in fall, the plants wouldn't break off. You'd have to cut them. And you really don't want to do that. But in spring, it's extremely easy to remove this material. So you break it off, and then I pile it on a tarp. And then the next thing I do is once I've taken all that off, I will take a leaf rake with very wide tines, and I'll very gently rake over it. I don't want to remove everything. Some of that, whatever remains, is going to break down into the soil, and there still could be insects, living in there. I don't want to remove everything. I just want to very gently get most of the detritus off. And then I take this to my town's composting center. I don't have room to compost this. This is one small section to compost this much material in all of my gardens. But that's really the major thing that needs to be done to a native plant garden. And this is a garden that consists of shrubs and grasses, of perennials and grasses. So that was care very quickly and as specific, I guess, as I can in this time frame. So I'll take questions about care if you would like, if there are any.
There are. I don't want to miss some of the earlier ones. Someone did ask, what do you do with invasive weeds in general if you don't use pesticides before preparing for the garden?
Well, herbicides would be what would kill weeds, not pesticides. But I guess I was lucky in that I did not have very much of it, but I very many invasives, and the few that do come in, it's very crowded now, so they don't really get in. I do a sweep through, particularly that forested area that you saw. I do a very careful sweep through that in the spring, because there's, as I said, there's English ivy around and there's Norway maples. I pull those seedlings. I will occasionally get some garlic mustard and I'll pull it. So what I would suggest, if you, usually you're doing this in a lawn. If you have invasive plants, obviously you're going to remove them before you do this. If it's just lawn or just sort of regular lawn weeds, smothering them will work. If you find that you have invasive plants, I would remove them by hand, unless it's an extremely large area. And if it is, and you have really serious invasives, like some of the things that are really, really hard to deal with, I would just consult some guides to do that, or even call in a specialist in that. Plants, every invasive is controlled differently. It really depends on the root system and how it spreads. Japanese knotweed is almost impossible to remove. It really probably would require herbicides and some time. If you just have some stiltgrass growing, which is an annual, you could probably pull it. And before it goes to seed in 1 year, there will be some remaining in the seed bank. But again, it's an annual. It's really easy to pull out. So the key thing is to learn to identify the invasives you have, to learn how to control the specific plants, and to the extent possible, get rid of them before you do the planting.
Two related questions. One was, when's a good time to thin out a perennial garden? And the second one is in fall the best time to divide plants? Would that be a good time to plant the divisions?
Yeah, the best time to do that is in early spring. Like for us, it's mid to late April. These plants, native, if you think of as prairie plants, think about what the Midwestern prairies look like, and we do have prairies in our area, although they would be short-lived. They wouldn't be permanent like the Midwestern prairies because we have more rainfall. But anyway, if you think about that, what those plants did, there was tremendously rich soil, and that resulted from the root systems of the plants dying back year after year and enriching the soil. So these plants get big. In the fall, in the summer, in the fall, their root systems are enormous. In the spring, their root systems are quite small. Most plants are quite easy to pop out, divide, put back in another place in the spring. So the same time you do the planting, you want to do the dividing. It's really easy to do. So like if you keep an eye on your plants now and you see where you make, like perhaps you want to make another bed somewhere, and you can see that there's an area where there are plants that could be divided, then you could plan for next spring to do that. You could prepare the soil in the fall by killing the grass, and then you'd be all ready to divide the plants in the spring. Very often you pop a plant out, you divide it as, you see how it falls. It may be, you may want 2 plants, you might get 5, and then you put them back in. You just decide where you want them and put one back in and put the others someplace else. I find I give away plants all the time. I put them on Facebook in my town, and I give away plants all the time because I just, I always want to divide things because I want to put in more plants. But I do that in the spring.
It's always fun to share.
Oh, yes, yes.
So one person lives in a large town home community, and he's asking, how would you approach gaining the interest of homeowners to planting a native habitat?
Um, I guess it depends on what your neighbors are like. Um, people are very, very different. I think I would start by showing them examples of native plant gardens that look very tidy. If you thought that that would help, and they don't have to look messy. They can, you can do it, you can concentrate on shorter plants and you can do a little bit of spacing and it can look very pretty. It doesn't have to look wild. You can make it look the way you want. So I think I'd show them examples of that. And to show them what it can do. And then show them the butterflies. Don't show them the bees. Show them the butterflies. That usually works. Show them the birds, but don't show them the bees. We don't talk about pollinator gardens. We talk about butterfly gardens when we do this. When I do this, just to a less specialist audience.
Here's an interesting question. He's asking, can you talk about iterations? Ideally, my garden choices would be correct the first time, but they never are. What do you do when your garden is going wrong?
Yeah, usually it would just be a couple of plants. Usually I'll give a plant a second try if I really want it. And then after that, I give up. There are one or two plants that I refuse to give up on because I'll treat them as annuals because I love them so much. But usually if I find a plant just doesn't work, I will just give up. If it's just, I don't know what you would mean by going wrong. I find most of these plants really are pretty easy to grow. So if the site is correct, I guess the first thing you would need to do is to evaluate the site again and make sure, go back to your references and make sure you put the right plants in the right place. If you didn't, that could very well be the cause of your problem. I mean, we always have bad seasons. You could have a season that's too wet or too cold or too hot. It may be so hot and dry that you have to water a perennial garden all summer, and in that case, you do. But for the most part, they tend to be carefree once established.
Okay, we have a question about oak leaves. Will oak leaves smother my plants if I leave them in place, or should I rake them and shred them before using them?
Okay, you don't want to shred leaves. And the reason you don't want to shred leaves is that if you don't use pesticides and you have native trees, there are going to be pupae and chrysalises amongst those leaves. And if you shred them, you're shredding those butterflies and moths. So you never want to shred leaves. There's a whole bunch of things you can do with leaves. The leaves that fall on your perennial garden and among your shrubs, just leave them there. Shake them off the tops of the shrubs, but leave them there all winter. That is food. That is habitat. That's what should be happening in nature. Leave those leaves. When you uncover your gardens in spring, gently rake the leaves off along with all the stuff that came from plants that are growing there, and then either compost it or you might have a place that's really out of the way where you can just put all of this material, where you can just put it all aside. And because that's habitat, that's the kind of area where you're going to get amphibians and you're going to get all kinds of insects living, and the birds are going to love to sift through. So I would not shred the leaves, and I would leave them. Leaves that fall on the lawn, they can kill the lawn. If the grass doesn't show through the layer of leaves, it will kill the lawn. As long as you can see some grass coming through, it won't die. It just needs the light. You can rake them to one side and use them. You can put them on your plants if you don't have enough big trees. You can, with some of them, run a lawnmower over them. And again, you could be killing butterflies and moths, but when you shred them with your lawnmower, just run it over them. That's lawn fertilizer. That's the only lawn fertilizer you'll ever need. So all of this is part of Leave the Leaves. If you Google Leave the Leaves, you will find all different things you could do with leaves. But what you want to do is recycle them on your own property, because that's nutrients. Those are the nutrients that your plants are producing. And why do you want to give them away? You want to find ways to use them on your own property. No, I hope leaves are great. They're very good. All leaves are good, but you want to, but oak leaves are very good.
Okay, I think you've got them all.
I get very excited about Leave the Leaves because we talk about that here in Glen Rock a lot. So, okay, are we ready to move on?
Ready to move on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm almost done. I just want to show you a couple of examples of really easy to grow plants. So this is a dry, sunny border. It's exactly the same spot in June and in early September. And I have not ripped out anything and planted anything, but this is an example of what close planting will do. So you can see in June, you've got orange butterfly weed, you've got sundrops, you've got bergamot, and you've got little blue stem just emerging. In early September, here's the little blue stem. It's in seed, it's beautiful. This Rudbeckia trilobum has emerged. It's probably in here somewhere, but we can't see it then. It has emerged and it is blooming. The bergamot and there's some asters back here. They're in here somewhere. There's some asters, but they're, if you were close up, you could see them nicely. So that's another thing that's there. But these other plants, they're still there. The milkweed has certainly gone to seed. It's all back here. But these, but the different plants are putting on the show at different times. So this is a good example of how close planting can give you at least three season interest. And then again, as I said, I would not cut anything down until the following spring. This is a very small area. It's maybe 6 feet by 4 feet. But there can be a lot going on in a small area. So just a few very easy to grow plants for sunny sites. And I've already mentioned most of them. I like this combination of orange butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. It is a plant only for dry sites. This is, I think, the fussiest of the milkweeds. It will not grow on a wet site. It does have tuberous roots. And it looks really good when you plant it with sundrops because they bloom at the same time, mostly in June. And the sundrops are shorter. Sundrops are Omithera fruticosa. And a place that I've seen them growing in the wild is between the clefts in the rocks on the seashore in Maine. So that's how tough a plant that is. Also, it turns red. Here it is in fall. It turns this beautiful dark red. This is, and again, I think most people are familiar with bee balm. So we have 2 or 3 species. The ones that we see the most, the red one is Monarda didyma. And the pink or purpley one is Monarda fistulosa. They're kind of interchangeable. I think maybe the Monarda fistulosa, the pink one, spreads a little more readily. In nature, Monarda fistulosa is a wetland plant. That's where you'll see it in a wet area. But in my garden, it does great. My soil was like beach sand when I started, and it does just fine. It spreads very nicely. This is little blue stem, which I've also mentioned. It's among my favorites of the native grasses. It does want poor soil and dry soil and sun. If you have richer soil, you might want to pick a different grass. But this one gets to be about 3 to 4 feet, so it's not enormous, and it's very, very pretty. We've spoken about Echinacea purpurea already. I find that the deer eat this immediately. It also likes a slightly wetter site. So I probably took this picture in my garden 10 years ago and haven't seen a bloom of it since. But if you can, you want to protect it from deer. This is my favorite of the Rudbeckias. And I mentioned it before. It's Rudbeckia trilobum. It grows to about 4 feet. It's a short-lived perennial, which means that the individual plants live maybe 3, 4, 5 years, but then they self-seed. And so I've always got it. And it makes the flowers are small. They're maybe 2 inches across, and they're this wonderful Crayola yellow-orange color. And they bloom for a long time. They bloom a little bit later than the other Rudbeckias. They're just coming into bloom now, and they'll bloom for October. This is, of course, is New England aster. You would want to have at least one species of aster in your garden. There are many species of aster. They are for sun, for shade, for wet, for dry. So you want to research specific the species that would do best. New England aster tends to be very adaptable. And you want to, one thing that you tend to see in nature, unless in more natural areas, is that asters and goldenrods and native grasses are all growing together. I'm about to go up to Maine, which we tend to do this time of year, and I know I'm going to see that everywhere. It's a wonderful sight. So asters, shade asters, sun asters, you want to include them. This plant here is a member of the mint family, and it is Agastache funiculum, and the common name is escaping me. Oh, Anis hyssop. Anise because it smells like licorice, and hyssop just because I guess that's a name that was given to a lot of plants, a common name. But you can see this is a buckeye on it, and like all members of the mint family, it attracts pollinators just like crazy. Again, these are all quite easy to grow. This is in bloom now. These are earlier. Again, this is sort of July, and these are all August, and all for sun. Just, again, similar thing for shade. This is a partly shaded border, and you can see it's in May. So what's in bloom is columbine, our native columbine. So when my columbine is in bloom, that's when I see hummingbirds. I would imagine they're migrating sometime during May, and that's the time of year that I know I'm going to see hummingbirds, because they like these red and orange flowers. And then growing along with it is our native geranium, or our showy native geranium. This is Geranium maculatum. And as you can see, there are lots of other things in here too. There are ferns in here, a couple of different species. There's a lot of shade aster. All of these heart-shaped leaves are, and this is the former name, but Aster divaricata, a white wood aster in here. There's lots and lots of things, again, closely planted. This garden is mostly shaded, and it actually runs right along my front sidewalk. I get a lot of comments about it. So again, different things growing side by side. It's spring, so some things are blooming, but in fall, like right now, these asters are just starting to bloom. Some plants for shady areas. I mentioned the geranium, and this is a spring ephemeral. It does go dormant after blooming. For the most part, it's gone dormant by now. A couple of native ferns. This is, I think in this picture, there's both Christmas fern and marginal wood fern, which both do well in very dry, shady areas. And this is a pachysandra. I think most people are familiar with Japanese pachysandra, which obviously is from Japan and not from here. This is this pachysandra, I believe, is not technically native to New Jersey. It is from the Alleghenies, but I planted and I recommend it to clients. It is a beautiful ground cover. It's called Pachysandra protumbans or Pachysandra allegheniensis. You see both Latin names. It has a lovely recumbent habit, so it mixes really well with the ferns. And in the winter, the leaves turn a silvery bronzy color. It's evergreen, but it does show some coloration, and it's a really good plant for very, very shady areas. Very quickly, Tiarella and Jacob's Ladder. The geranium again, false Solomon seal. These are two, I've forgotten what aster this is. Somebody might be able to, it might be divaricata again, because I find it spreads. But this is crooked stem goldenrod, Solidago flexicalis, which does okay in shade, and very pretty and very, very easy to grow. So these are two, a shade aster growing together with a shade goldenrod. And I would suggest that you not turn your nose up at violets. We have about a dozen species of violets, viola, in New Jersey. They are our state flower. They are the only host plant for fritillary butterflies, and they're beautiful. So they make a really nice understory. I have them, I originally had them all over my lawn when I bought my house. And then as we just created gardens by mulching, they stayed. They just, they have really thick roots. They have really thick rhizomes, and it's very hard to get rid of them actually. And they just stayed. So they're there. They're all right under my plants in all of my gardens, and that's fine with me. They create a nice ground cover. They hold moisture. They work well. So those are some easy to grow plants for shady areas. Again, I'm pretty much done. I will take questions again, and I will leave this slide up while I'm taking questions, because this is your sources. Again, you are going to receive it. So I'm happy to take more questions. And other than that, that is the end of my presentation. So if there are more questions, I'm happy to do it.
Okay, let me look. There were a lot of questions about the names of the plants and all those last beautiful slides.
Okay.
Which
yeah.
Susan's video was really good at popping the names in there. Let me go back and see. Oh, okay. Here's a question. Where can I buy native grass seeds, and any special care to grow them?
Okay. I would always recommend that new gardeners, people who are just starting out with native plants, start with plants and not with seeds. There is a mistaken belief out there that you can clear some ground, or even not clear some ground, throw a handful of native wildflower seeds there, and you'll have a native plant garden. You won't. You'll have a lot of weeds. The reason is that these plants have enormous root systems, as I've already mentioned. For the most part, they take 2 to 3 years to bloom from seed. And in that first year, many of them, and particularly the grasses, will only be a couple of inches high. So any weeds that are present, any even native weeds that are present, because they're mostly going to be annuals, they are going to outgrow them. They're going to shade them out, and you're going to have a mass of weeds. That's why you clear the ground, you mulch the ground, and that way you could see what's there, and you start with plants. It's by far the easy way to do it. I would mention that Toadshade Wildflower Farm, which is the business that's run by Dr. Randy Eckel, who is a board member of the Native Plant Society. She does sell seeds of all New Jersey grown plants. They are all New Jersey local ecotypes. She sells both seeds and plants, and that's the best source of seeds that I know of, particularly for local things. I actually do not know if these others sell seeds. Maybe other people on the panel know that for sure, but Randy certainly sells seeds at Toadshade. But I would not recommend, if you want to start with seeds, put them in flats or in pots, and then prick them out, let them grow even for a season in the flats, move them onto bigger pots, and finally move them into the ground. But that takes a long time. That can take 2 years. So I would really recommend that you start with plants. So I hope that answers the question.
Here's an interesting question. Is it possible to plant on a stream bed when the water level changes dramatically? It sounds like it might be go dry at certain times of the year, and then when you get a lot of rain, it gets very wet.
I would imagine that it is because there are going to be plants that are adapted to that kind of thing in nature. So I would start by finding a stream that, or doing some research about what plants grow actually in streams. So, yeah, I mean, certainly there are lots of plants that do really well along stream banks. And again, if you use these databases, you can find exactly those plants that in nature grow along stream beds. One place you could go to see this, I've been involved for many years with the Arboretum here in Glen Rock, and it is it is a red maple swamp, and there are many swales, most of them dug, but some of them natural streams that run through it. And you can, most of the foliage in a certain small part of it is native. In other parts of it, there's lots of invasives, and we're working on it, but there is a small part with all native plants. And if you look at that, you'll see sort of what's growing in these areas that get, where the water level fluctuates. Jewelweed is something that would certainly work in a place like that. Swamp cabbage, certainly. There's a lot of swamp cabbage in this area. Skunk cabbage, excuse me, I'm sorry, skunk cabbage.
Someone wants to know if you have any favorite native biennials that you can recommend.
Erigeron is a biennial, or there are biennial genuses, daisy fleabane. There are a couple of species, and at least one of them is a biennial. I'm trying to think. This is not coming to me. The tall plant yellow flowers. It's an Oenothera. Evening primrose is a biennial. It's native. You would need to to make sure that you always have flowers if you want to grow them in a garden. So you would, after the first year you would, but you would want to make sure that you always have flowers. Of course, garlic mustard is a biennial, but we don't want to talk about that. Other native biennials are not coming into my head immediately, but I know there are some. And if any of the panelists think of any, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, let's move on.
I am looking. I think that you've answered.
Well, those are the two that are pretty. There are lots of, I'm sure there are lots of. Oh yeah, the most common black-eyed Susan is a biennial. Rudbeckia biennis is a biennial. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that's it. And thank you so much for your time and answering all the questions and the great presentation. Lots of good information in there. And
you had asked me to put my email address in, and there it is.
Oh, great.
Last slide. And yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you. And I'm going to remind everyone we're going to send that resource list of information. We'll email it to everyone who attended and everyone who registered. So
thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Wonderful job. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Good night.